Hello and welcome to a global event hosted by Kingspan. At Kingspan, we like to stay curious and ask, what if? What if the building envelope could have lower embodied carbon? And what if we could have a full spectrum of insulation solutions that have lower embodied carbon but the same thermal performance? Today, we'll be hosting a masterclass on lower embodied carbon insulated panels, namely QuadCore Lec. You might have questions as well and be curious, and if you do, please email the email address behind me, and we will deal with them after the presentation is finished. If you have any questions that we don't have time to answer, we'll answer them after today. I'll now hand over to Lizzie, who will take you through this masterclass.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So hi everyone, I'm Lizzie Young, Head of Sustainability for Kingspan Insulated Panels, and I'm here to ask the question, what if building envelopes could have lower embodied carbon? In this presentation, I'll look at the legislative landscape of the built environment, look at what Kingspan are doing to decarbonise our own business and our products, and spotlight QuadCore Lec. This graphic on the slide will be of no surprise to anyone who works within the built environment. Essentially, it's showing us that 40% of total energy and process-related emissions come from the built environment, and 11% of those come from building materials themselves. That's a huge opportunity for those building materials and a huge impact that they have on our current environment. As grids decarbonise more and more throughout 2030, 40 and 50, the impact of building materials become ever more important. But that isn't the only driver at play. So also carbon budgets are being implemented both at a global level, so you have the EU cap and trade system, at a country level, so as you can see on the screen there is the UK carbon budgets and impacts of the building sector, but also at a sectoral level. So I'm speaking here in Icon in Ireland, and the Irish commercial built environment has an absolute 45% reduction target by 2030 from a 2018 baseline. So real staggering challenges. But those carbon budgets are also applied to at building level through net zero energy buildings or nearly zero energy buildings. So even EPC ratings are a form of limiting the amount of operational energy or carbon associated with buildings. And finally, the global green economy. So a recent CBRE Ireland research paper said that 100% of respondents looked for a LEED Gold or silver rating when acquiring a building. That's really significant because it means that green certification is driving the ability to let and tenant buildings. This is driven through initiatives such as the CSRD for buildings, for companies at the EU level, but also TCFD in the UK and the EU taxonomy. So it means that green certification and the green economy is driving specifications and buildings. But where is the sector today in that landscape? So we have a sector that's developing net zero energy building standards, implementing extended producer responsibility schemes, EPRs, embedding the use of life cycle assessment and mapping in buildings and products, and demanding lower upfront carbon products immediately today. But that's not linear across the entire sector and across every single country. 110 countries in 2022 had buildings built without any mandatory building codes. That's the entirety of Spain's built environment built last year with no demand reductions on any of the operational consumption. The difference is pretty stark country to country, but that doesn't mean that it's a bleak experience. So let's make that even more granular and look at buildings in action. On the slide here, you can see a typical warehouse with office space built in London. Now, London is a highly regulated market. You have the London Plan, you have LETI, you have the UK Green Building Council, and you have the upcoming Part Z potentially coming into implementation, which means that it's a market that's really looking at net zero buildings, net zero energy, operational and embodied. And in this graphic, you would historically expect to see that most of the impact of these buildings come from the operational carbon. But you can see here actually that carbon emissions to practical completion were 47% of the impact of that building, which is significant. It's almost half of the impact come from essentially the materials, the transport to get those materials to site, and the install, which shows just how critical design and concept design and building materials is when you're designing net zero buildings or trying to reduce the impact of buildings overall. But that's not all doom and gloom. There is a massive potential opportunity here. So with high impacts is high opportunities. And you can see, according to the IPCC latest status report, that buildings as a sector have an opportunity of demand side mitigation of a 66% reduction which is huge by 2050. It means that there is 66% of existing emissions contributed by that sector could be mitigated, which is a massive impact on global greenhouse gas emission reduction. So where does Kingspan come into this picture? This is semi-purposefully a very busy slide. So if you're on a laptop at home, you probably see it's quite a full slide. But it's here to show you that manufacturers and other industry stakeholders have these net zero roadmaps in place. And mapped over top, you can see the Kingspan impact on this particular Green Building Council roadmap. So manufacturers' responsibilities can probably be summed up into 3 phrases: absolute carbon reductions, lower carbon products to market today, and accessible and accurate product certification. If any viewers are watching from an investor, a contractor, or a developer perspective, you too have your own green building net zero roadmap, and it's really helpful to look at it and see how it shapes your reduction potentials. Again, you can see here further targets established in the World Green Building Council manufacturers roadmap, critically mapping of supply chains and having reduction plans for key products. And you can see I've highlighted here how QuadCore Lec falls into this net zero roadmap. So let's get into Kingspan's supply chain and have a look where our impacts are. So where do our business impacts lie? On this slide, you can see the overall impacts of Kingspan's entire supply chain from 2022. As it's quite obvious, most of our impacts come from our upstream raw materials. That's where 82% of our entire greenhouse gas emission contribution came from last year. That's not to negate the impacts of our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which was 5% of our footprint and the second largest contributor. And also to have a look at our value chain downstream, you also have to have a look at products in use and applications, and of course, end of life of products. Homing in on the most material impacts, you can see that below not only is delivery of these critical to Kingspan's Planet Passionate programs, but it's also really critical to delivering lower embodied carbon products to our customers. You can see the specific targets in place. In this middle bar here, for example, 50% emissions reduction in the primary raw material suppliers to combat our upstream Scope 3 target, 90% absolute greenhouse gas emission reduction on our Scope 1 and Scope 2 as part of our science-based commitments, and 42% absolute reduction in Scope 3 value chain. And the difference between that and our internal target is that also encompasses the product use and end of life. And you can see that delivery of all of these, we believe, would equal lower embodied carbon product offering that will support customers achieve their net zero buildings. So where do our products impacts lie? This is taking it down one additional level of granularity. And this product is QuadCore architectural wall panel, so QuadCore AWP, and we've looked at it in 100 mil, just to give you an indication. So as you can see here, we've mapped an LCA of our AWP product, and very similar to what we saw at our building level, 81% of our impacts come from our upstream Scope 3 as part of the cradle to gate. So A1 is where our raw materials sit, and A2 is the transport of those materials to our manufacturing sites. You can also see here significant impact is A3, which is our manufacturing processes, which is 6% of our impacts come from our Scope 1 and 2. I'll come on to talk about C3, which you can see here also has a material impact. 22% of our product LCA impacts come from our processing of the product at end of life, and I'll come on to that in the next slides. It's really important that gathering insights like that through LCA help frame our decarbonisation pathway. So as established on the previous 2 slides, our largest impact comes from our key suppliers and our raw materials. That's in no small part because we had a net zero energy program that ran from 2011 to 2022, which delivered on things like renewable energy, energy efficiency, electrification, process improvements, and that's continually ongoing. But now also what's been highlighted is the importance of supplier tracking and collaboration, that supplier engagement and investment, which has led to things like the H2 Green Steel investment by Kingspan Group. And ultimately, the ultimate goal is to transition Kingspan Group's portfolio to offer lower carbon products in the future. Alongside that collaboration, we are embedded what I would call some enabling principles. So of course, one of the critical enabling principles was the Planet Passionate program. So it's a 10-year program over 4 key areas of energy, carbon, circularity and water. But it also focuses on building on our net zero energy program that I mentioned earlier and the science-based targets that are aligned to no more than 1.5 degree scenario. The enablers, as we see them, are clear target setting, regular monitoring, transparent reporting, embedded life cycle assessment, so using those LCAs to drive decarbonisation, data-driven decision-making, investment in new innovators or investment in collaboration with existing supply partners, and dedicated innovation function where I talk to you from here today, ICON. Now, after all of that landscaping and all of that monitoring, analysis and engagement work, we're here to offer some solutions and introduce QuadCore Lec. Launched in March last year, we initially launched on 3 insulated panel products, which you can see on the screen. We have QuadCore AWE, which is an architectural wall panel, QuadCore KS1000 RW, which is the roof and wall application, and QuadCore Cold Store, which is a cold store application. These products are launched currently only in the UK and Irish markets, but soon to expand into other markets and across other ranges as well. The product itself is the culmination of pretty extensive supply chain collaboration and on-site renewables and engagement, and this is just the beginning of the customer experience. Going back to 2019, 2020, when the Planet Passionate programme first launched its material reduction target of a 50% reduction in carbon intensity for primary raw material partners by 2030, that was the starting gun, and that was really the North Star for this project. Alongside this, as we spoke about Scope 1 and Scope 2, there's also the drive to generate renewable energy on our sites and manufacture with renewables where it is possible. And I keep mentioning collaboration with our supplier network, but that is really critical. So implementation of sustainability and supplier engagement days, collaborating with those suppliers to help drive us forward and create that market, and Kingspan to create that market for lower carbon, higher recycled content products and raw materials to make those products critically. Also, I keep mentioning and referencing to circularity and end of life and how that impacts also on the greenhouse gas emission story. So exploration of end of life of our products is also very critical. We see that in our LCA mapping, and that's something that continually is ongoing. There's the Kingspan Group investment in H2 Green Steel, which is a Swedish hydrogen steel manufacturer. And that brings us to today, 2023, where we have 3 QuadCore products launched in the UK and Irish markets that offer good reductions on their embodied carbon. I also want to mention some other enabling principles that are alongside this that will future bring reductions to QuadCore Lec. So the implementation of an internal carbon price, which we've modelled to show a potential 1 kilogram reduction per metre squared of products as part of the LCA. And there are plenty of other things that are now ongoing between now and 2027. So for example, as I mentioned, LEC offering embedded into new product ranges, ever expanding this opportunity to new applications. Investigations into bio-based product offerings at ICON, as you can hear in other presentations as part of this series. Inclusion of recycled PET as part of the Planet Passionate programme into QuadCore, which would launch QuadCore 2.0 and QuadCore 2.0 LEC. Delivery of material passports, so the enabling factor of bringing data to our customers so they can easily interpret and understand what is on the building, and that's very critical for net zero buildings. It also enables more circular potentials of the product, which we're very keen. And utilisation of H2 steel, enabling Kingspan to expand volume and range of LEC offerings for the future. So how do we tell the story? EPDs are really critical, and life cycle assessment is also incredibly critical. Again, another busy slide for you from me, but one of the core enablers to transitioning is those LCAs. So another CBRE Europe research said that 53% of respondents stated that poor quality of data was the barrier, the main barrier, and then pursuing ESG goals. So what's really critical from Kingspan is when we're talking to you about LEC, we're providing you with the data to back it up, and it's accessible and will help you understand it. So in this table, you can see the reductions in GWP total, which is the indicator that we've used to explain embodied carbon, A1 to A3, which is the product phase, everything that we do as Kingspan to manufacture the product and bring it to market, but also the total life impacts of the product and the reductions associated with modules A to C. So the core takeaway from this is that QuadCore AWP LEC, using that product specifically as an example, just to give you some indications, shows a 21% reduction in LCA modules A1 to A3, which is the product stage, when compared, and critically, when compared to QuadCore AWP standard product. So it's apples with apples. When comparing modules A to C, which is the product to end of life, so includes the construction process, use phase, and end of life processing, the overall reduction is 15% versus standard QuadCore AWP in 100 ml thickness. I also want to note that EPDs aren't the entirety of a product. You can also have plenty of other certifications, and there are plenty of other indicators as well alongside the GWP total factor. So it's important to have a look at products in totality of buildings and not in isolation. We are working to develop a sort of checklist for customers to help them engage with EPDs and understand how you can make proper and appropriate comparisons. So now moving on to have a look at the same table we looked at before, but for QuadCore LEC. This is slightly more visual than the table that I previously showed you, just another way of explaining the data. It's also important to show that we have directly impacted the target areas that we were looking at, so the raw materials. So we brought those reductions in, and you can see exactly which module the reductions have formulated in. So in A1, which is just raw materials, you can see a reduction. But what's really interesting to me is that even though the number, the GWP total, so 10.5 kilos of CO2 equivalent per meter squared, hasn't changed versus QuadCore, it has now got a higher impact on the product LCA, which means that the next thing that we'll be looking at for this product is embedding more circular principles and using our life cycle framework to deliver some alternative processing options. And that's what's important with continual review of certification and continually looking at your LCA and using that good data. It also quite nicely highlights what I was speaking about as grids decarbonise as well. You'll see that the overall pie is shrinking, but there are certain indicators that become ever more and increasingly important. So taking the next steps. Obviously, we saw the roadmap, and this is just the first step on quite a long roadmap. But here, again, highlighted that this is all part of the Planet Passionate programme. So we're continually driving down the impacts of those raw materials, and the next big steps really is circularity. So looking at building end of life, designing out waste from our manufacturing processes, design for disassembly, removal of fossil fuels from our manufacturing where possible, and next-gen insulation materials. And you can see there the enabling principles are throughout this. So what's next for QuadCore LEC and the wider Kingspan insulated panel range? So when having a look at the future of the sector and the decarbonisation of quite maybe entrenched supplier networks, it's quite important to provide opportunity to decarbonise whilst acknowledging that it's a sector with quite a lot of sunk assets. And so bringing the sector along with us and collaborating is really interesting and really critical to delivering decarbonisation in the short and mid-term rather than looking at these long-term targets. So one topic that is constantly discussed and it's currently being reviewed for its practical use in the construction sector is mass balancing. And I've put on this slide a few considerations for mass balancing and how it might be useful to delivering future decarbonisation from raw materials. So number one is the recognition of approach. So whilst this is used predominantly in the energy sector, when you're having a look at renewable energy contracts or renewable energy certs, it's not really used in the construction sector very obviously. There's also a concern around greenwash. So what's incredibly critical is that this would be regulated, that you would have credits that you would be able to retire, and it would be seen as a transitionary tool rather than the ultimate end goal. And importantly, funding the transition. So oftentimes when we're talking about collaboration with our suppliers, we have to be very considerate to the fact that they have decades of sunk assets. And whilst we would love everyone to transition to clean fuels, to looking at alternative materials in their processing, it's really important to help people get there by helping them have a way to fund that transition. Particularly when we're looking at some of the existing supplier networks who want to incorporate bio or biogenic materials into their processes. Another option and another consideration for the future of decarbonisation is really bolstering that supply of this lower carbon material. So a critical avenue is the volume of low and carbon material that are hitting the market, and a great example of that is Kingspan's investment in H2 green steel. So H2 green steel is a less carbon intensive steel that will hit the market 26-27. And as you can see here, offers some significant reductions just for the raw material versus basic oxygen furnace. And you can also see from the graphic below how it mitigates the need for fossil fuels such as coking coal in the reaction process. These figures have been taken from H2 Green Steel's website, and as you can see, they're very impressive and offer us a lot of hope as to what the steel sector can get to in the future. And then finally, looking at biogenic materials. So there are plenty of other presentations on specific material offerings that Kingspan is delivering over the next year or coming years. But it's important to have some considerations as well around this, but important also to provide some setting for it. So the European Commission recently said that bio-based products can make the economy more sustainable and lower its dependence on fossil fuels. And for this reason, the EU has declared the bio-based product sector to be a priority area with high potential for future growth. And at Kingspan, we completely agree with that. At ICON, we're exploring many options, both as substitutes for certain raw materials, but also for bioproducts themselves. And it's important to consider the provenance of those materials. So where have they come from? Could that possibly be a byproduct, which would be great? Is that a byproduct that would otherwise be discarded and we could incorporate into our products? It's also very important to consider that these materials are often natural materials, so clear supply chain mapping to mitigate land use issues and food security issues are massively important. And that leads us on to the final consideration, which is certified and regulated. Now, it's important also, talking about obviously QuadCore Lec and the integration of some of these things in the future on that roadmap and throughout Kingspan, to say that every product has its place. And depending on what the demand from the customer is, it might be that there is a hybrid solution available or solutions available for the building, and that everything must be considered in building totality rather than a one-size-fits-all solution. That's the end of my presentation. I really appreciate your time and listening. This is QuadCore Lec. We're really proud of this product. If you want to find out any more information, please use the link there or access it through our website, and I'll pass back to Lucy. Thank you.
That was really interesting. I do have a couple of questions for you from the audience online. So you've mentioned scope 3 in the presentation. What are you doing for scopes 1 and 2?
Yeah, great question. So as I showed on my slide deck, about 5% of our greenhouse gas emissions as a group from last year came from our scope 1, scope 2. And scope 1, scope 2 is energy essentially. It's associated with the production of the energy and the consumption of the energy on our sites. So we're doing things like energy efficiency projects. We're doing things like massive on-site generation projects. So we have big PV arrays across the group. We actually have a target of PV arrays across the group. We also have targets for on-site generation from renewable sources. So really looking to remove the fossil fuels out of that, which we think will bring down those scope 1, scope 2 emissions.
Okay, thank you. And can you explain a little more about what an EPD is?
Yes, yeah. EPDs can be quite complex and kind of scare people sometimes, which is understandable because a lot of figures in tables. Essentially, all it is a product nutritional label. It gives you a load of indicators and it gives you a figure against all of those indicators to show your impact against them. And it's the culmination of a life cycle assessment, which essentially looks at all of the ingredients in your product, all of the manufacturing impacts that you have, any installation impacts you might have. If your product requires maintenance throughout its process, that's included there. And then it provides scenarios based off of a select number of scenarios for the end of life of your material. And so EPDs can be used to have a look at in a building application, and typically please use EPDs in a whole building application. It shows you the impact that component has on your total build.
Okay, thank you. And we've just had another one come through also. What's next for Kingspan's product development?
I think a lot of it is based at ICON. So ICON is an innovation hub. I think a lot of it also relies on our upstream supply chain. So further engagement with our suppliers, bringing on new innovators. Kingspan's really great at incubating and bringing those ideas to the fore. So I think QuadCore Lec is a great example of that. It's been able to move something through quite quickly, create that market. We hear something, our customers need lower embodied carbon materials. We see there's an opportunity and we create a market for it. So I think what's next for QuadCore Lec specifically, as you can see on the roadmap, is more decarbonisation. and hopefully we can continue to lower the impact of that product.
Thank you. Okay, and as always, if you do have any other questions, we'd be happy to answer them via email. Please do email the email address on your screen at the moment. And thank you, Lizzie, and thank you for the audience for watching.
Thank you.